slide 10 gets into the third assumption in this section. Every individual and each organization's moderators fall somewhere along the various continuums. We'll get more into this into the next session. The assumptions that the moderators are more or less evenly distributed in the general population when you look at the larger population, and that the more you reduce the number in the population and specialize to specific professions, industries, etc., and reduce it even further to a specific employer, the more skewed the curve becomes. It's no longer a bell-shaped curve, it's a skewed curve, either favoring the right or favoring the left. Finally, there is your own set of moderators, which is thrown into the mix, known as your place of employment. The next session's exercises will help you begin to get a better handle on the individual continuums and where you may be placed in them. Then, the session after that, we will begin to tackle your perception of your place of employment. Remember, there are no right answers as much as there are your perceptions, which may be accurate or may not be, because it may be influenced by where you are with respect to the Johari window. This is discussed a little bit more in the next slide. Understand that we are trying not to place judgment or blame, but rather we hope to gain an understanding of why everyone responds as they do, and how the final ethical or unethical outcome turns out as it does. As we said in the previous session, this is not a prescriptive model, it is a descriptive. We are trying to describe what is actually happening, not prescribe how things should happen. Fourth and fifth assumptions. As you complete the continuums in the next section, what you will be identifying is your, quote, preferred, unquote, style. That is to say, you are identifying your initial response to situations and circumstances you are faced with in life and in the workplace. Take your time and reflect. The stronger you prefer something, the more likely you are at one end of the continuum or the other. Don't be afraid to identify yourself with the extremes, if that is in fact accurate. Don't let the bias that seems to pervade our society that suggests that to be extreme is somehow to be wrong. But as you consider the initial responses as yourself, do you ask yourself, do you immediately dismiss your immediate response in favor of a more moderate one? Why? That is where the fifth assumption comes in. While your initial inclination may be, for example, high ego strength, principled stance, where do you end up? What other factors come in from your own second guessing, from others, from the pressure of the organization, as they all come into play? So there is the preferred style or response, which is probably your more true self, the way you really are. But then there is the fallback position depending on the impact of other personal moderators and outside pressures. It seems to make sense that the more you are rated at high ego strength, internal locus of control, field independence, principled moral development, the influence of others will have less impact on what you finally decide. And the more you are at the opposite end of those scales, the more likely you will just go along and follow the tide. Slide 11. These three assumptions have to do with our perception of ourselves and others. First, we tend to rate ourselves higher or lower than we actually are, in fact, in the individual moderators. Whether we rate ourselves higher or lower may largely relate to where we are with respect to the Johari window, which is something we'll discuss more in the next slide. Second, if we do not live up to our higher expectations, we tend to give ourselves excuses for a less than stellar performance, giving ourselves reasonable sounding excuses, a rational lie that helps get us off the hook. Conversely, if we have lower expectations of ourselves and we perform better than expected, we tend to account our better performance to forces outside ourselves. Finally, we tend to judge others more harshly than ourselves. We, looking from the outside, do not reflect on the fact that everyone lives in their own head, with their own experiences and perceptions, which leads to varying degrees of success and failure, good and bad decision making, etc. We are putting this assumption on display every time when we say, quote, he or she should have done whatever. Slide 12 lists assumptions related to the Johari window. Essentially, the more open someone is suggests that they have greater insight. There is more consistency, therefore, between what they say and what they do. This is simply because they are exercising that insight, and they are being upfront about what's going on in their head, what they are thinking, and why they are doing what they're doing. Consequently, others around them can compare notes between what they say and what they do, and they'll seek that consistency there. The closed person has less of that insight, so they don't fully know why they are doing what they are doing, or they have a misperception of what they are doing. They think they're being consistent, but others outside themselves know that they aren't. Without the insight into their motivations and a full understanding of what's really going on, there seems to be no real core from which their judgments and their actions can originate. The hidden person is, as the name implies, hiding something. There is something about themselves, perhaps from their past, or some flaw they see in themselves, they then compensate for in order to hide, or whatever, which they seem to be trying to keep this from others. However, this hidden part of themselves is also a motivating factor that drives, or at least greatly influences, their judgment and their actions. In the end, they don't keep other people informed about what they're thinking, feeling, or are afraid of, because to do so would be to reveal what they are trying to keep hidden. There then develops a disconnect between what the person says and what they are actually doing. As suggested earlier, an additional feature of the Johari window is to understand that the larger the open area, the greater the insight, in other words, should result in taking the inventories, completing the continuums, and so on, that we'll be involved in with the next chapter, and you will find that they will be more accurate. They will be more reflective of reality. The person with larger closed or open areas may find their efforts to be difficult, or at the very least, more inaccurate. Slide 13 is drawn from the book The Criminal Personality by Stanton Samnow. Dr. Samnow lays out his continuum that ranges from the responsible non-criminal person on the far left to the extreme criminal on the far right. Between these there are two other categories: the non-arrestable irresponsible and the arrestable irresponsible. The two extremes are easy enough to lay out. The responsible is the law-abiding citizen who follows the rules, obeys the laws, pays their taxes, they don't cheat on their wife, etc. The extreme criminal is just that. They have no conscience to speak of. They think only of themselves. They view other people's possessions as really belonging to them, and all they have to do is figure out how to get it for themselves. They are at the center of the universe, and the people around them are viewed as things used to get what they want. The non-arrestable, irresponsible person is essentially the person whose behaviors are, well, they're just irresponsible. Their behavior creates problems for other people, such as they might be slack at work, they might tell white lies, they may manipulate or perhaps even intimidate, but none of the things that they do are really arrestable or criminal. The arrestable irresponsible is all that the non-arrestable irresponsible is, only ratcheted up in intensity. Where the non-arrestable is lax at work, the arrestable may be stealing from work and even casing the place to determine whether they can rob the place at some time in the future. The arrestable is better able to put a face of respectability on while committing crimes both minor and major. And while the responsible person is carefully making choices in their life, the non-arrestable person is making half-hearted efforts to make future plans. The arrestable person is living in the moment and is planning some future crimes. The point of laying out the continuum of criminal behavior and personality here is that it is another way of looking at yourself and looking at the place where you work. You may be a responsible person, but you may be working in a place that is extreme criminal or arrestable irresponsible. You may be a responsible person, but with maybe some non-arrestable, irresponsible moments, but maybe the key person in your organization, the decision-maker, the supervisor, when faced with an ethical dilemma, may be more non-arrestable, irresponsible, or maybe even arrestable, irresponsible in their tendencies. These factors are important to know about yourself, your coworkers, and the organization where you work. With slide 13, we've finished this session. Review the book chapter and complete the assignment. Begin to read ahead into the next chapters, especially the individual moderators section. We will finally begin to really get into the meat of this course and the book in the next session as we begin to complete the individual moderators and look at the various exercises and templates that are there. Thank you for your attention, and look forward to having you in session 3.